The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to the Race IndyCar Podcast. J.R. Hildebrand back alongside me. We've had a couple of weeks apart. We had Matt Bierce subbing in for you for the last episode at Road America, and he, in his own words, has hair more like Santino Ferrucci than Pit Lane Jesus. So he was definitely bringing something a bit different to the table, but still brought something to the table very well. So we thank Matt for stepping in. He's going to be doing a little bit around Milwaukee, I think, as well later in the year. So we'll look forward to welcoming him back then. JR, you've been busy, as I have, and we had that little break, but it's nice to get back into it here with Laguna Seca. And to be honest, a much more enjoyable race, at least in my opinion, than last year's race. Obviously, last year's race was great because it was the finale and you have all those storylines developing with the championship and all that kind of stuff, but it was still a bit of a hot mess, really, after the resurfacing and all of the kind of cautions that we got last year. It felt like we struggled to get like 3 or 4 racing laps together. So this was at least more of a traditional kind of motor race, even though we did have a few cautions towards the end. I think breeding cautions there. But yeah, I guess, how have you been for a start? And also, did you kind of share that view? Did you enjoy this one a little bit more than last year's race?
Yeah, I did. I've been good, but yeah, it was definitely, I felt like just a more enjoyable race to watch. You had sort of, we'll get into it obviously, but you had these sort of split strategies that, was interesting to watch play out for the rest of the race. I think this was a little bit more of like the typical IndyCar, like good IndyCar race that we like to see. Certainly some calamity and some things not going right, and people making mistakes along the way, but certainly compared to last year, just a lot fewer situations that seemed just totally avoidable. We saw a lot of racing incidents in this race, and I think it also went to show that Laguna, being an event that is just in the middle of the year, can work really well, which is cool to see. Some of these events, when you put them on the schedule and you kind of only see them as the finale or something like that. And Laguna used to be the finale, that it was the Champ Car finale for a long time, or the kart finale for a long time as well. So we were used to kind of having it as a race that you cared about in that context. But to see an iconic track like this that is known generally for being a place that's rather difficult to pass. It's quite a short lap, can definitely be the type of place that's a bit of a procession over the course of the event. To see it be quite a good race right in the middle of the season, I think says a lot about its place as a part of the IndyCar schedule just going forward, which, I guess it's just one of those things. Obviously, I'm a West Coast guy. Like, I like tracks like this anyway, but just as an iconic sort of open wheel venue, you like to be able to see it, sort of serve its purpose, I guess, in that context. So I thought overall, an interesting race to watch. Some various aspects of it that became unpredictable, basically, as we sort of got into the closing stanza, and and certainly a very deserving winner in the end in Alex Palou.
Well, I think we'll have to have some sort of written warning for the next time that you go away for a week and a half, or that we don't record for a week and a half at least, because it's been a pretty busy news cycle in that gap between Detroit and now. We've only missed one race together, and yet we've gone through some of the most spectacular IndyCar storylines you could possibly imagine in the space of about 2.5 weeks. Just to recap and summing that up, we've had Theo Pourchaire having death threats from fans, Agustin Canapino missing out on the Road America race. We've had Theo Pourchaire dropped from McLaren and replaced by Nolan Siegel for this weekend at Laguna Seca, and that's just to name some of the major ones. But getting into this race, I guess, you mentioned Laguna Seca's place on the calendar, and I think it's been a place that has been sort of criticised a little bit in the past, maybe for maybe not having as much investment as people would like, or maybe the advertising of the race not being as strong as people would like for an event that kind of is almost synonymous with IndyCar in a way. And I guess that means that fans and people in the series and in the paddock are desperate to have that kind of level of the race being that iconic, matched by all of the things that come with that. Something like what we've seen at Long Beach over the years, and Laguna Seca hasn't always had that opportunity, or hasn't always had that level of investment. But we've seen with the resurfacing and some of this stuff that they've been doing recently, that there's been a lot of effort to try and bring this up to one of IndyCar's sort of top level events. And as you mentioned, the strategy definitely helped with that. I think we were saved by Alex Palou being the kind of sole leading car to go off on a different strategy, because if everyone had stayed on his strategy, I wonder, with his pace, whether it would have been another 2022 situation where he's off a minute into the distance. But just to kind of sum up basically what happened, we had a caution at lap 36 where we had one group of cars basically split off and pit, and we had Alex Palou followed by a number of other cars who did come into play later in the race, and I'm sure we'll get into those. But Palou was the standout candidate on that strategy, staying out there, because he was the one who was able to make a gap of 20 seconds to the guys who had pitted. That's what allowed him to basically make the strategy work, because he came out in third but didn't have to fuel save like everybody else did in order to get to the end of the race. So he'd basically just done a really long stint, cut out the fuel saving, which meant he could use all of that amazing pace that he and Ganassi had and have had in multiple events here, where his record at Laguna Seca is just amazing. So it's one of those situations that we quite regularly point out, where it looks like someone's taken a strategy and maybe that strategy has been the reason why someone has won, but in actual fact, the person who's won on that strategy really has to make that strategy work by delivering the level of pace that Alex Palou was able to do. If he hadn't been able to gap the likes of Colton Herta by 20 seconds before he pitted after the caution, then I very much doubt this strategy would have worked. So the fact that he was the kind of sole outlier on that strategy really made this race kind of interesting and work out really. Although I have to say, there was never really a moment in that race where I thought Palou was going to lose it, apart from the caution at the end where Newgarden kind of jumped up into second was a big moment, and I'll ask you about that in a second. But just on Palou, how do you kind of feel where we're at? I mean, we've got a lot of short ovals coming up in the second part of this season. We've got obviously the hybrid coming in, mixing things up, but Palou especially has been, if there's any weakness in his game really, it's been short ovals, and even there he's done things like score a podium at Iowa, which is not the easiest thing to do. How are you kind of feeling about the championship and the way it's playing out? Because we've seen it yo-yo over the past handful of races between Palou, Will Power and Scott Dixon. So I guess I kind of look at this as a really key race for Alex Palou to put them points on the board. That gives him a little bit of kind of, if he does struggle at any of those short ovals, and obviously Milwaukee being a new one, he's kind of building up the points now to have that opportunity to be able to drop a few points, kind of later in the season.
Yeah, I sort of think that the Penske package on short ovals is the best package out there. So if we were kind of to isolate those three contenders in Palou, Dixon, and Power, I think if you were if nothing goes wrong basically for any of those guys, probably my money's on Will to be on average the best of those three guys at the short ovals that we have. And we have as you pointed out, we have more short ovals than usual heading towards the end of the season. And honestly, I would sort of factor in Nashville as a short oval track. I think you'll find that the packages that are good at places like Iowa will end up translating pretty well to being good at Nashville as well. Dixon is certainly somebody who's in a position to take advantage of having the car underneath him at those places. He's been to all of them. He's been really successful at all of them in the past. Ganassi used to be great at those kinds of tracks. So just given that we're going to a couple of them that haven't been on the schedule in a while, I think that's a point is in his favor. So really all of that is to say that I think that Palou's got a battle on his hands to the end of the year, because of the fact that two of his main championship rivals are going to be in good equipment, in Scott's case, in the same good equipment that Alex is in. They have a lot more experience than he does at these places, in part strictly because of the fact they've actually been to a couple of these tracks and Alex hasn't. That's not always a huge deal. I think at Nashville, that'll count for more than like what you might kind of say on the surface of it, just because it's such a weird oval track. It sort of harkens back to the IRL era of IndyCar racing and IndyCar oval racing, when you had a lot of D-shaped mile and a halves on the schedule, and Nashville was kind of this outlier, but raced a little bit more in that way. Like it kind of raced between a D-shaped mile and a half and a short oval track like Iowa, or maybe even kind of Gateway. So I think that'll be a place where having been there actually counts kind of for a fair amount. Because guys aren't going to have a lot of time. It's going to be another like straight into qualifying kind of situation. A little bit of added comfort from prior experience, and just having kind of some of those guys just kind of wrapping your head around. I mean, like it was the first place that I ever tested an Indy Lights car, and I still remember that really distinctly. There were just these like couple of things that were the types of things that you think about for any oval track, but that you actually thought about in quite in like a much more direct way at Nashville, just because of the surface, because of the corner radius, all this kind of stuff. So I think that'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to watch it play out because of that Alex is actually at a relative disadvantage when it comes to showing up to particularly those places that are all the way at the end of the schedule. The hybrid, I don't really have a particular opinion on. I think it's kind of a wash between the championship contenders. Like I don't personally think. I think Ganassi and Penske have both been doing a lot of the testing. they're all going to be sort of equally prepped for getting into doing that. So I don't really count that. It may turn out that one team or another just has managed to sort that package out better, but I don't even really anticipate that happening between those teams. So I would sort of look for Alex to going to the rest of the road and street circuits on the schedule. Are there any more street circuits on the schedule? Toronto still.
Toronto, yeah.
Yeah. I would look for him to be as competitive as we would expect him to be without the hybrid system at those places, which is essentially putting him in contention for being a race winner at any of those places. Dixon's really good at Toronto, just bringing that up. So, I mean, my sort of gut feeling is that this is going to kind of come down to Scott and Alex. And just given the schedule, even more so than usual, there are a lot of reasons to be bullish on Scott Dixon's chances to pull off another seventh championship this year. Will, I basically look at just as kind of the dark horse, not necessarily because of exactly where he's at the points, but just because it's a little bit more of an unknown in terms of exactly. He's on really good form. He's on the type of form that took him to a championship a couple of years ago. He's definitely like righted the ship from last year. He's talked about that in a few interviews lately, which I found really interesting for him just to talk about kind of, more of the sort of personal side of what maybe made for a less than sort of stellar on track performance over the duration of last year, or kind of on average last year. I found myself having a lot of sympathy for that, and just kind of, I guess I would say, just without thinking about it any deeper than this, like, I really appreciate when guys talk about things that are going on, and Will's been one to do that kind of usually a reasonable time after the fact. Like, you don't really hear about it when things are happening for Will, but that I definitely made his year last year make a lot more sense to me. And so it'll be interesting to see. Like I said, I think he's a little bit of the wild card here, just because he can go out at any of these places. I mean, if there's somebody to stick it on the pole at a bunch of these places for the rest of the year, it's still probably Will. It's just always that question of, do they have the ultimate pace and kind of execution to do what Alex Palou has been doing weekend to weekend, and that just seems, when Alex and the 10 crew are really on it, that he's kind of still unmatched at a lot of these, certainly at these road and street circuits.
I definitely think it comes down to willpower and how many of these oval races he can win, because if you look at the road courses we have left on the schedule, we have Mid-Ohio that Palou won last year, and Dixon won, I think, as recently as 2019. Obviously, Dixon won in Toronto, and Palou's been good there in the past as well. Portland, I think Dixon's on a run of like 3 podiums there, and Palou has obviously been very successful there as well. I think we can expect that the Ganassi guys are going to be very good in those road and street circuits, and I think a lot of how this plays out now is going to be how strong Will Power can be. Obviously, he was on pole, double pole at Iowa last year. We go to Gateway, and we do 2 races at Milwaukee and Nashville, three unknown races to end the season. So it's going to be fascinating to see how all those played out. And if you're listening to JR talking about Will Power and what he's had to say over recent weeks, you can definitely go back and listen to the Road America episode where Matt Beer was talking a little bit more about that as well, and giving his opinion on basically the same as you, JR, just saying it's really nice to see drivers open up. And although we sometimes forget this, obviously racing drivers are humans as well, and it's pretty cool when they just step back and say something like, racing secondary to what's going on in my life at the moment, and learning a little bit more about how people's lives are playing out like that definitely enriches the sport for the fans and the people watching. And yeah, obviously we have sent our best to Will on multiple occasions, and it's nice to see him back at the sharp end. He had a pretty interesting race here in Laguna Seca after a tricky qualifying. He was back in 15th. He was one of the people who took one of the really super early pit stops and was able to kind of move his way through the field. The incident with Scott McLaughlin was kind of the key point of the race where it could have all fallen apart for him. Turn 6, contact between McLaughlin, who absolutely sent it down the inside of Will Power and ended up breaking his own suspension, I think there. Will Power managed to finish 7th, so put some key points on the board, 1 spot behind Dixon, while Palou obviously won. Couple of other little things to wrap up. Obviously, Alexander Rossi having that phenomenal run to 3rd for Aaron McLaren, big result for him. He's been saying quite often, I think, that if he qualifies better, then he's going to be in contention to win races. And part of the reason why he hasn't been as good in the races has been because he's been starting further back. And I think that definitely tallies. I think he's definitely been much stronger in races than in qualifying this year. I don't think anyone could argue with that. And he's not quite. I guess he was in contention for the win early on, and if he had been able to stay ahead of Colton Herta there, I think he might have had a chance. But I think it's just unfortunate that he chose this day to qualify well, where Alex Palou was just a cut above everybody, not just Alexander Rossi.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Romain Grosjean, JR, also up there, 4th, and Juncos Hollinger's best result in IndyCar. It was kind of just another crazy weekend for Grosjean. Another kind of incident with Ferrucci in the warm-up before the race. Grosjean was criticising his fellow competitors in qualifying for the way that they back up. I enjoyed Hinch addressing that on the broadcast and basically saying this has been a problem for about 10 or 15 years in IndyCar. This is not a new problem. But Grosjean obviously felt like, he said he felt like he had a pole car and should have been on the pole. Obviously, we saw Callum Ilott on the front row here a little while back for Juncos as well. We know that car's relatively strong at Laguna. Agustin Canapino had a great run. His best run in IndyCar, arguably on a road course in last year's race. So, yeah, I think Romain felt like he could have been on pole and could have been fighting a little bit further up. He followed Alex Palou's strategy and used it to great effect. Did have to do quite a bit of passing at the end and get quite aggressive in that last stint. But yeah, I guess interesting one this JR, because I still feel like Romain and Juncos are kind of where they should be in terms of like the championship and and what I mean by where they should be is like the kind of level of performance and the rounded package that they've put together this year looks quite similar to Juncos in recent years, where there's been peaks of performance and then drops in performance. Roman's made some mistakes himself. I think the team has struggled at certain events as we expected, but this is more of what we really needed to see and what we expected to see in previous races, like St. Pete, for example, a track where Juncos has gone well before and Roman's gone well before. So to see them do well at Laguna was pretty cool after a peaky kind of run. But it doesn't make me think now that Roman's going to go on some amazing run and finish in the top 5 for the rest of the season. It feels like a one-off still, based on the performances of that team through the first half of the season. I don't know if you think that's a fair assessment, but I'm definitely not ready to rule out Roman being in the top 5 again this season, but it definitely doesn't feel like the team's quite ready to make that kind of leap forwards that maybe looks like after this race.
Yeah, it's always hard to tell. I mean, like you said, this is, I think, a big reason for why I would agree with that is just because this has been a place that the team has been pretty good at before. So it's not like it's a little bit less indicative of them having, or at least on the surface of it, it's less indicative of them having fundamentally figured something out that is going to translate, generally later. We've had other situations. Rahal last year was one where, kind of halfway through the season, they go do a test, they show up to the next race, they're actually a lot better at a place that they didn't really anticipate being good at.
Yeah.
Those are different kind of circumstances where you sit there and go, okay, like maybe they actually sorted something out. And so they've just found pace that translates, at a lot of other tracks that they'll go to for the rest of the year. To your point, this felt a little bit less like that. It felt, it was also an event where I feel like there have been a couple of other events over the course of the season that it has seemed through practice that Romain would be in contention for like qualifying in the top 6 and running up front. And for various reasons, the qualifying doesn't go according to plan. And then they kind of can't recover from that during the race. So this at least bucked that trend of seeing them kind of have pace, and they were able to, in a general sense, at least make good on that. I think that the only other thing that I would just make note of generally in terms of how the race played out was unfortunately for Romain and a bunch of the other cars that were on, in essence, the leading strategy or the main strategy, call it the Alex Palou strategy. But it was, I mean, to briefly break that down, it was going to be a 3-stop race either way. It was 3-stop with big windows. So by a bunch of cars, Kirkwood, Herta, and Rossi basically all taking that, lap 36 caution. They basically were making their second stop super early, so they were only going to have one stop to go. Whereas, like you pointed out, Palou, Grosjean, McLaughlin was kind of in the mix on the alternate strategy because he had pitted early, and this is another weird race where like the undercut was actually like a pretty good move, basically because tires came in right away, and if you had clear track, you were able to rip the lap just as easily basically on an undercut strategy as you were on an overcut strategy, which is more typical that kind of the staying out a lap later than everybody else is usually the thing that works. So we kind of had both, and depending on just where guys were at and the pace of the cars they were around, both of those were on the table just to try to affect your track position relative to other cars. And that especially that first round of stops that was green flag stops, you saw a lot of both basically just because of the fact that the windows were so big. So then that's second stop under caution that like half of the cars took and split the field in half. I think those cars were actually, they were really lucky that there was not as much yellow for the rest of the race as we've seen in the past at, certainly like as last year at Laguna.
Yeah.
But they were lucky that there was as much yellow as there was, because otherwise I think you end up with Palou winning the race by a bunch, Grosjean in second, those other cars that were on that stayed on that strategy. So we're having to do no fuel save, even though they had lost track position to the cars that had made that other stop or made that earlier stop under caution. Those cars were looking pretty vulnerable for a big chunk of the race with like 30 to go still. Because they didn't have those late race yellows were not evident that they were going to occur at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I bring that up in the context of Roma, basically just to point out that there was a slightly different version of this race where they really did fully maximize what was on the table for them just from a strategic perspective. And he was damn close a couple of times on restarts towards the end to being able to make up a spot or two there. He definitely had the pace in hand, particularly when, Kirkwood, Herta, Rossi were on fuel save, to kind of get up to Palou and at least start to put a little bit of, I don't think he didn't have Palou's pace, I don't think, but
no,
to put some distance between the lot of them. So I think they're probably feeling like there was a little bit more there even that really would have elevated their spirits after a pretty tumultuous start of the year. But altogether, made for an interesting end of the race. And I want to touch on Rossi there really quick because, I feel like we've seen this happen to like Christian Lundgaard a couple of times also, where basically he's genuinely in contention for winning the race through periods of the race. And just because of the way that a couple of yellows fall or a pit cycle works out, or
I know what you mean.
He got kind of jammed up, I think, in the pits when they all pitted under caution. I think that's when he lost the position to Colton.
That's right. Yeah.
Which then on that strategy, then he becomes the rabbit that you've got to somehow get around if you want to be in contention for the win. We saw this happen with Lundgaard and Palou at Indy GP earlier this year. But it's like he kind of had everything he needed to have to win the race. The circumstances just didn't quite play out. They got for things kind of having nothing to do with his performance on in and out laps or his race pace or whatever, just got a little out executed in some situations, almost just like by accident or by coincidence, basically. And, for things like that, like you get held up a tiny bit in your box or something. I remember watching that pit stop for Rossi and was like, oh man, like he's in the box in like a totally wacky direction. Now he's got to get out of it from like a weird pit in angle. And I'm sure he just lost a second there. That was the difference between him coming out, ahead or next to Colton and him coming out behind him. And then Colton and the, 26 guys or whatever were just good enough basically to not get screwed by that, and probably weren't doing as good a job as Alex was hedging against saving fuel. It didn't sound like, but then got helped out enough by the way that the yellows fell at the end of the race. So I do think, I guess I basically bring those two guys up to say, I think Alex Palou was kind of a half a step ahead of everybody, or a half a notch ahead of everybody, just in terms of the margin that he had to pull off whatever strategy he was on, as long as he was going to get clean air at some stage. Like he did seem, even from the beginning of the race, even though he didn't lead right from the get-go and didn't really actually get into the lead of the race until that other group of cars took this caution. It just seemed sort of inevitable that he was going to end up at the front. But as far as those other guys went, I think Alex and Romain were probably left thinking at the end of the race that like they could have both certainly been second, and it just didn't play out that way.
Yeah, you mentioned Palou not leading the race. It was because he was overtaken twice by Kyle Kirkwood, at least at the start of the race, around the outside at turn one, and then Kirkwood pulled off another opportunistic move down the inside as well at the same corner. Some lovely overtaking on display from Kyle there, and I feel like he's kind of maybe a good way to measure what you're talking about in terms of how much better the Palou strategy could have been, because Kirkwood 5th and Dixon 6th, their fastest laps of the race were like well outside the top 15, And I think the fact that they haven't pumped in like at least one lap that was like a top 10, a top 15 time, despite being in the top 5, you know, and for most of the race as well, I think that kind of shows how much fuel saving was going on and how kind of inferior that strategy actually turned out to be in terms of actual pace. Obviously, it worked out okay for those guys based on how the race played out, but just in terms of like actual pace, looking back in hindsight, I think that shows you a little bit of how hamstrung they were in terms of how much pace they could use and what they could do. I wanted to mention you kind of mentioned late race cautions and not knowing how that was all going to play out. I don't think anyone expected Joseph Newgarden to jump into second place at the end there. This hasn't happened, I feel like, and it's been brewing for a little while, where IndyCar's kind of changed this rule where they would used to throw out the caution pretty aggressively after an incident, especially if there's like a car stopped in the middle of the track or something like that. And I think the measure has been for a little while a crash, as in like a car coming together either with another car or a wall or something like that. They would throw the caution immediately. But recently, if the car's been kind of in a space that's deemed to be relatively safe enough to be able to continue for a short period of time, to stop people from getting hosed by an immediate caution coming out, they've left the pit window open so that if anyone's kind of left out on track, they can come in and pit. Now this is good because it totally avoids those people who've stayed out having their race completely ruined by a caution. But on the opposite end, and what I feel like we haven't seen since this has been a thing, is a driver getting quite as much advantage from this happening as Joseph did in this race, because he would have been well outside the top 10 after he'd made that pit stop, or at least somewhere around 10th.
He would have been hovering 12th. Around 10th, basically, probably.
In that area. And in actual fact, because he didn't have to do an outlap, because the caution was thrown after his pit stop, it meant that he jumped all the way to second. And this is something Scott Dixon's been quite vocal about on multiple occasions, where he's addressed it when there's not been such a big advantage for the driver getting that, but he still said, I don't really like how this rule is and how it plays out. We had Colton in the press conference after the race kind of be like, well, I mean, I'm paraphrasing for Colton a little bit, but he was kind of like, it's good either way, or it's bad either way, and it's difficult to kind of, neither of these things solves the other problem, if that makes any sense. At the end of this, there's a problem either way. However you do this, there's a problem. I don't know. I just feel like if that I would have been sorry for Joseph if we would have done this the old way and he would have been totally hosed by that caution. That would have been bad. But I feel like it would have been worse if he'd have somehow taken the lead of the race in that situation, or been, you know, it would have been the thing that allowed him to challenge Alex Palou and maybe win the race. And I think it's important to kind of separate this out into the rule and the context of what happened in the race, because this is not something that's happened often. Like I said, it's, you know, we've not really seen someone get this size of an advantage from this before. So where do you kind of stand on this rule as a driver and how it's being done? Is there an element of there needs to be some sort of middle ground in how this is done, or is there a different way to do it, or is it just a case of everyone has to make their bed and lie in it? This is just how it's going to be at every track, and we just have to kind of take the rough with the smooth in this situation.
Yeah, I think, like you said, this is just a particularly extreme example of how it plays out. I mean, I can remember a situation only because I was like, it took me a minute to figure out what had gone on. It just happened to be that Newgarden was kind of the bogey in the opposite way at Mid-Ohio last year. I think it was last year. It was either last year or the year before that he was among the group of cars that had already pitted, and that basically just because the other cars didn't have to do an outlap, that, you know, he was running second or third or something, and then like ended up outside the top 5 because there was a number of cars that had pitted, and McLaughlin was the one in that scenario that ended up in the lead after, and he had been running second or something. Like, it wasn't like he was. So it wasn't quite as dramatic in terms of seeing somebody get like this huge gain, because there was more cars in the group that were like pitting at the last minute, basically right before the caution was going to come out. But to Colton's point, you got one or the other here. Like, either you're screwing people's race that are still out, or you're sort of helping those same people. Like, it's one or the other. and it's always going to be the same group of cars. Like it's going to be people who have not yet pitted that are either going to get like a notable advantage or they're going to be at like a significant disadvantage. It's interesting just comparing this to like Formula One, where it's always a huge advantage to pit once the caution has come out. And it's kind of like, it's actually the caution is already out. And so they kind of have this, they have something that is akin to what we're having happen here, which is there's an incident. They're about to go under caution. It's set up in a way, not purposefully so in Formula One's case, but it's set up in a way that if you haven't pitted yet, you are going to gain an advantage by pitting like once the incident has occurred. The thing that is actually kind of a nice middle ground about, and I'm not suggesting this, but just it's worth pointing out that there's a nice middle ground there, which is that the field is under caution at that point. So at least you kind of remove the risk associated with the fact that there's a car like pointing the wrong direction at the exit of a corner somewhere. They brought this up on the broadcast, which was like totally accurate.
Yeah.
Which is that, okay, where Armstrong was way offline. You're not going to end up there. They've got yellow flags at the corner, so you're not going to have cars like coming out of that corner too wide or something, which like really is where you anticipate the problem. There's also a non-zero chance that somebody just drops a wheel and loops it there. So even if they're supposed to be going slower, and then you have this sort of weird situation for the rest of the lap, which is like everybody's anticipating a caution coming out. It hasn't actually happened yet. And so you have sort of a weird, like I can recall being in situations like this where your kind of brain is telling you to like slow down because there's a car, like clearly a caution is going to come out, but you have to not because there's this whole track position thing that's still in play.
Yeah.
And so it just ends up making it like the way that F1 ends up treating this, the outcomes are often similar, but it's a little bit more structured in terms of like how it's actually going to work. And you're mitigating some of the risk associated with cars like still being flat out when really it should be under full course caution at that point. I guess I'm kind of the opinion that like, I'd kind of rather just have it like if they're going to go to caution, just like go to caution basically. And like if some people get hosed, some people get hosed. And that's partially because IndyCar is, I feel like kind of a long ways away at the moment from being able to, you know, in F1, they have sector times that you have to keep to, and that's like communicated very clearly on the dash to the driver. And so you kind of are managing your pace under caution, under safety car, these kind of different situations.
Yeah.
Like with a lot of built-in structure and like kind of thresholds and stuff for what like being fast or slow under those conditions means. And we just don't do that at all under any circumstance in IndyCar. It's like basically there's a pace car on the track or there's not. And so I don't know. It's just a tricky thing to manage. And I guess it's in this particular situation when you've got Joseph like having served a drive-through penalty earlier and all this kind of stuff. The fact that he then is the guy that you end up seeing gain this huge advantage. Like at that point in the race, it's kind of one of those things like, did he kind of earn that? You know, like not really. So I think that for the other competitors, for Colton Herta, for Scott Dixon, that's even more ammunition. I mean, certainly coming from Scott's perspective, that's even more ammunition to say that this is like a silly way for this to end up working out, you know? Like I think Scott's point of view is very much like, I'll take the chance that I get screwed by staying out long if we can not have this situation where guys end up just getting like lucking into gaining a bunch of spots, basically.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough one. I think you're right about the virtual safety car thing that they have in Formula One. There, they even have that in the junior formula. So as the drivers come through the ladder, they're familiar with that and ready to go in Formula One. And it's a system that's been in use for years now, and it is kind of well known to everybody. But yeah, it's an interesting one, and I definitely definitely just think like less interference and like vehicles and people on the track at all times is for the good, for the better. You know, I appreciate you want to get medical assistance and people out to check on people and make sure that people are okay. But generally, I don't like the idea of like, if the caution is necessary, then it needs to come out straight away, in my opinion, instead of this kind of waiting and delaying. And I know they wouldn't delay it if they didn't think it was safe to do so, but still, like you said, the opportunity for someone to loop it there and cause an even bigger incident is not ideal. And it's going to be interesting with a hybrid. I'm guessing there's going to be some element of needing to wait for the car to be safe for marshals and the safety crew to touch it and stuff. So you might have a situation where in some cases you've got a driver sat in the car stationary for just that little bit longer than maybe they would have been in the current formula, because the crews are kind of waiting for the car to be neutral and that they can touch it. I think that'll be another interesting element to this, because there's a potential that you might just have to leave someone out a little bit longer. So we'll definitely keep an eye on it, but it's kind of hard to get too deep into it just because of how like unusual this set of circumstances was and how unlikely this is usually to happen in this case for Newgarden. And it didn't really matter in the end because he ended up spinning and dropping down the order anyway late on in the last few laps. So another disappointing performance for him, really. Ended up 19th after that. Having jumped into second, it's kind of like, he got the opportunity to take a huge advantage out of all of this happening and wasn't able to really make up some points on some of his competitors around him and put himself back in a decent championship position. So that was sorry to see for the Indy 500 winner. There's a few other stories I wanted to get into, JR. I think we should mention two people who I feel are kind of linked. We've got Nolan Siegel and David Malukas. So David Malukas, you can go back and listen to our recent episode where we interviewed him ahead of this race. He talked about his test at Milwaukee, which is his first time in the car since his wrist injury before the season started. Obviously, he was expecting to come back a little bit sooner than he did. The delay meant that McLaren ended up releasing him in May. He was then on the sideline, expecting to be out a lot longer than he was, but Meyershank dropping Tom Blomqvist from its IndyCar lineup opened a seat there, and within the space of about 7 to 10 days, a deal was done for Malukas to jump in that car. So this was his first race with that wrist. He spoke on the pod about being a little bit kind of, I don't think nervous is the right word, apprehensive maybe is the right word, about how his wrist was going to do over the course of race distance, how it was going to cope with that last corner at Laguna where you have to put so much lock on, and also the pit entry, which is even more lock. And we saw even some of the most experienced drivers like Scott Dixon get that a little bit wrong when he took too much curb coming into the pits and ended up nudging the barrier there and was almost collected by Scott McLaughlin in that scenario as well, which is another incident that could have changed the shape of the championship moving forward. But luckily, Dixon got away with that. Malukas, I think kind of went under the radar a little bit because I'm almost 100% sure that he would have finished ahead of Felix Rosenqvist, who started in third, and would have also almost certainly been in contention for a top 10, if not better. So if you're wondering why he dropped down the order, it was because he had a puncture and he had to pit, and he still managed to come back from the back to 16th. Admittedly, at that point, there was a few cars out and didn't have to actually pass too many at that point, but still to come back to 16th was a good result. So I'll let you address him in a minute, JR. But the other one's Nolan Siegel, who we've not really had a chance to talk about on the pod, who was a shock replacement for Theo Pourchaire for this race. There's been a lot written about this and a lot talked about, so you can go back and check out the-race.com where you can find out a little bit more about that news and a little bit of opinion and stuff on Nolan coming into the seat. Obviously, everyone thought McLaren was happy with Theo and that he'd done enough. At the end of the day, he'd been signed until the end of the 2024 season. So I think that was as much as you can give a driver in terms of telling them that they've done enough to warrant a seat. But as soon as Nolan kind of made it clear that he was up for getting rid of his Indy Next program after he'd stepped in at Road America for Agustin Canapino, McLaren felt like they had to act. sign Nolan, and they were worried that if he'd have gone somewhere else, they would have lost out on him, and he would have, they would have missed the chance to sign him in 2025 as well. So keeping Theo for a year and then slotting Nolan in, they felt like that wasn't possible, and that they were gonna miss out on him. So a really interesting story. Everyone, I'm sure, will have their opinions on this and how it's played out. I think fundamentally, you've got a reigning Formula 2 champion who's only 14 or 15 months older than Nolan, who's, I think, been relatively impressive in terms of what he's done with no testing and no kind of prior American racing experience before. And then you've got Nolan coming in, who's obviously a very talented driver who in the past has kind of not always finished championships or has taken races away from championships in order to do races in different places and stuff. He's not always focused on a championship, but he also hasn't won a significant championship and finished third in Indy Next last year. So there's definitely a dearth between the resumes of these two drivers. Should we start with Nolan, JR? His race was really interesting in the sense that he spent the first stint kind of stuck behind Stingray Rob. He tried to work his way forward as best as possible. He was running about 21st and then had a spin. I think he was running 6th at the time of that spin. But the weird thing about that was that he'd stayed out despite... he pitted on lap 20, so he was with those early guys who pitted. But all of those early guys pitted under the caution around lap 40-ish, whenever that was. But Nolan didn't and stayed out. So Nolan had jumped to 6th, but almost certainly would have had to have pitted inside probably less than 10 laps at that point. So he was going to have to do a green flag pit stop when everybody else had taken one under the caution. So I felt like that was... I've not spoken to the team about that or not got a read on kind of why that decision was made, but that seemed odd to me. But then immediately after that, he spun anyway, and then had to come back for the rest of the race and ended up coming back to 12th, which was perfectly acceptable. And I feel like it would have been maybe even more celebrated if it had been a different driver and different team or a different scenario, different set of circumstances. But in this case, I think people were watching really closely and obviously saw him spin. And also the way he kind of worked his way up to 12th was through very few overtakes. It was a lot of people getting penalties and a lot of people going off track. He was the beneficiary of a lot of other people's mistakes as opposed to his own kind of searing pace or anything like that. But I think you'll look back at some other drivers' races and point to them and say that that's kind of part of IndyCar racing, is staying on the track and putting yourself in a good position to capitalise on some of those people having those issues. So yeah, just like his appointment at McLaren will be controversial, I'm sure this race will be controversial in terms of how people kind of sum it up and how people saw it play out. I think for me, it's exactly what I was kind of expecting from Nolan at this point. It's his first race with the team. It's only his 5th IndyCar start. I feel like I wasn't expecting any kind of searing pace or anything, particularly stylish or special from him in this circumstance, especially in a race where there was a lot of fuel saving and that Laguna Seca is, a particularly difficult track to overtake on, a difficult race to make your debut with any team. But under all of this spotlight and all of his attention that this move has kind of brought, I'm sure it's not been an easy weekend for Nolan. But I think my feeling is that he'll need to kick on from that quite significantly if he's going to, turn the fan base around and get people behind him and kind of acknowledge that he's the right person for this seat and that Tony Kanaan hasn't put his position at Arrow McLaren at risk to sign Nolan Siegel just so that... without that level of performance, Nolan's going to have to improve, I think. But did you have any thoughts on his race and Malukas' race as well? Keen to get your thoughts because I know you've been a driver who's had injuries before and you've also stepped in for people with injuries before and you've got a good idea of how that can derail your kind of preparation or just your race in general. But this is more of like a comeback story, I guess, and a pretty happy one for David. Although that puncture did drop him back, I think he'll be really happy with the pace and what he was able to achieve in this weekend. He'll know that deep down that was a good weekend, I think. Yeah,
I think I'll start with David and just saying that, I think he definitely exceeded expectations. Just because, I just hearing about the signing, and that he's going to get in the car at Laguna when that happened. That was a few weeks ago now, but I was kind of like, Okay, well, I mean, at that point, there was still kind of rumors circulating that he was like not going to get back in an IndyCar ever again. I mean, like which I guess just goes to show, like, don't listen to the rumor mill, or don't take that. But that clearly that clearly wasn't true.
Yeah.
Regardless of exactly where he's at or what his race fitness is, Laguna's not an easy place. It's not, I mean, it's maybe not the hardest place on the schedule. He'll find out really how that thing feels when he gets to Toronto. But
Oh, jeez.
the, but that's, the left hand will definitely take a beating on a, clockwise circuit that's bumpy and rough and still rubbers in a lot over the course of the race, more so than an anti-clockwise, like smooth track, or for that matter, the ovals. The thing that you end up really combating over a period of time is both the fact that, and they mentioned this on the broadcast, so I won't go into it heavily, but I broke my left hand at Long Beach in 2017, and basically had to missed one race that was the next weekend at Barber, and was back in two races after that, still with basically a broken hand, with still have it, like 15 little screws and a plate and whatever, like holding the tendon to my bones. And you start with like a fairly encumbering big brace that you sort of have like fit. And he's got a wrist injury, which is different than a hand thing, but so everybody's situation is different. But I guess the point here is that you'll go through a brief period of time, whatever your recovery time is, that it's hard to just stay race fit, basically, because you're supposed to be trying, especially when it's a hand thing, hand, wrist, whatever. There's a lot of swelling that you get in your outer extremities. And so it just takes forever for that to really go down. That ultimately, after the healing process is done, even once you can start working out again, is something like that's something that David will be fighting for the rest of the year, probably through this upcoming off season. Like, it'll take a full year to get to the point that you are no longer just combating inflammation, basically. So that's your kind of, your problem number one, is that you just get a little bit out of shape while you're trying to recover, particularly on that side. Problem number two is that you're going to have restriction of motion. Problem number three is that you've got long-term swelling that you're going to have to deal with, that ends up affecting like the strength that you have on tap using that, arm, wrist, hand, whatever. The fact that he was able to be as competitive as he was, just in one lap pace, let alone that he was in it without that he was not one of these guys that was like just spinning off track or losing hold of the steering wheel, or having things like that happen over the course of a race, has got to be super encouraging for him and everybody in his camp for the rest of the year. So he's not out of the woods in terms of seeing stuff like that happen. When Joseph Newgarden, my experience kind of as a fill-in basically was for Joseph in 2016. He actually didn't even break a hand or a wrist, and just was dealing with like heavy swelling over the duration of that year after his accident at Texas, which was like immediately post the 500, I think, at the time. That he had issues. I mean, he had a crash at Toronto that year that was, I think, partially just because he like kind of didn't have the expected strength to hold on to the steering wheel, like hitting the apex curb somewhere around the track, that I got subbed in at the last second to do their Iowa test or their Mid-Ohio test or like some other thing, as kind of like second man in line on standby for that situation during the season. So I guess I bring that up mainly just to say that, David's not out of the woods just because this went okay, but certainly an encouraging sign that you'd anticipate. We've also got like a big gap in the schedule coming up, which will help his recovery start to like, he'll know more about what he actually like needs to be able to get out of that hand and wrist and be able to work a little bit more towards that end. So anyway, I think that's mostly my perspective on David, which is like a lot of upside basically based on this weekend. It's worth noting that, part of the reason that he's in that slot is because it needed some funding to like pull that together. But, he's put himself in position to be, in contention for these kinds of situations with regardless of that, basically just based on his performance through the end of the year last year, I think. And so, maybe that's more like added bonus to like completely make the situation make sense for Shank. Not necessarily the thing that's putting him in the seat. When it comes to Nolan, I think it's hard to really to contextualize what the truly like unbiased opinion is here in terms of, because there's just a lot of things that are influencing this situation broadly. You brought up a bunch of the reasons why I think people are a little sour for how this is going on. And that is, in my opinion, like totally valid. Like there's a part of this that when you look at kind of the resumes of these guys, when you look at the way that this is going down, even just what's happened on track earlier this year for either or of those drivers, Theo and Nolan, if you're just looking at it from Theo's perspective, it doesn't really seem like he deserved to just get shoved out of the seat at this point. Like I'm sure that came as quite a shock to him. And
he tweeted on the Monday before Laguna Seca saying how much he was looking forward to racing there. So the decision literally came days before the race weekend was due to start.
Yeah, and then you kind of see who you're being replaced by, and I'm sure in his mind was just like, WTF, like that doesn't even, there are these times in your career as a race car driver where stuff like this just happens that you're kind of like, wait, what? Like, how did this go? Like, that doesn't make sense. You're kind of prepared to not do an extraordinary job as a race car driver and be replaced by somebody who either in their credentials or just in terms of like, you have some awareness for the fact that there are just other guys out there that are more qualified or better than you are for where you're at that particular moment, for a given situation. So you're always kind of prepared to get axed and be replaced by one of those drivers. But when it happens like this, where it's neither of those two things, in any particular way, like I think we could be reasonably objective that there's not a lot of like data points in any variety to suggest that Theo's being replaced because Nolan is actually better than he is. That it just leaves you. It's hard not to become bitter about the business of motorsport in situations like that. And that I think that's broadly how fans who are frustrated by this move are feeling also, that you can sense that this is kind of not like, this is in some way, shape or form transactional. This is not strictly because, they're just sticking the best available guy in the car, or they're trying to or they're even necessarily trying to figure out who that is. It would even be a different thing if it was kind of like, well, we're going to stick Nolan in the car for a couple of races and see how this goes. But when it's this abrupt and it's kind of a long-term commitment, that's not what it is. And then anytime, and then at that point, it's kind of like anything that anybody says, I'm gonna circle around to making like making the point that's on the other side of this fence here in a second. But just to complete this thought, then at that point, anything anybody says, whether it's Zach or it's Tony or whoever, it's just kind of like, whatever, you're just talking out of the side of your mouth at this point. Like you can only take that so seriously at that stage. It's why I find myself as a race fan rooting for guys like Kyle Kirkwood, who just smoked everybody in F2000, like wrecked everyone in Indy Next, left there to be no logical option on the table but for him to move up to the IndyCar series. And okay, it's on him to prove that he deserves to be there, that he deserves to have a seat that some other guy shouldn't have, or whatever, or even it's up to him to prove that he's better than somebody who brings a little bit of money to that seat in those situations. But you kind of you want for motorsport just to be a survival of the fittest based on talent. And so when when these kind of situations happen, regardless of what regardless of what the core value of the talent might be, when it hasn't been proven in a way that these other guys have, it remains there remains a much more significant burden of proof that this isn't strictly just a transactional thing. And so I think that's in my mind, to kind of contextualize like where Nolan is at and how whether it's fair or not necessarily, like how he'll be judged, and how McLaren, in essence, for making this move will be judged, is proof to us that something that we don't, basically. The other side of that coin is Nolan is an extremely talented race car driver. There's no question about it. He's been a race winner in everything he's done, including that he just was part of the team that won the 24 Hours of Le Mans in LMP2 for Zach's side team, United Autosport. So I guess there are data points and there are proof points of his talent that just are not exemplified in winning championships over the course of a period of time. Malukas was very much the same way. Like he didn't win championships on his way up and funded his way into seats in the IndyCar series and was good enough doing that to put himself in a position where, then you kind of transition out of that. Honestly, if I'm just being honest, and this is where my bias as a race car driver probably comes into play, that like I don't really love that either, to be totally honest. But once you get to that point, then you do start to be able to play by different rules, and it's fair enough at that stage to be able to do that. So, with Nolan, it's actually, I think, just like if I was advising young drivers who were in this situation, personally, I'm not sure, right or wrong, I'm not sure that I would advise them to do things like this. Because you're actually putting an incredible amount of pressure on being better than what you've showcased you have been up to that point, by like rushing to get to the top level. And the argument against that is that there's only so many there may not have been an opportunity for Nolan to find himself in a McLaren seat unless he and his backers like jump on this opportunity that presents itself here. So like it's hard to pick apart the exact scenarios, but it is putting himself it's putting him in a place where it's like, okay, dude, like you had better show that you can live up to having been given this opportunity, basically at this point, like ready or not, here it comes, and it's kind of like the reason in some respects that the ladder series exists is to do some of that work prior to needing to do it in the big show, basically. So it's just, it's a tricky, I in a way, like, it's easier to navigate when you have to just kick everyone's ass and like hope that you get a chance to move up. Basically, it's almost harder to do it when it's harder to figure out exactly what to do when you can financially like back yourself into some of these situations. But it kind of puts him in a spot where he's not going to get the benefit of the doubt that he is a rookie and he should have. We've talked about this a number of times, how quickly guys that are rookies in the series end up getting axed or end up getting like, moved on for somebody else. for a whole different variety of reasons, at least just in terms of how people judge his performance, he's not going to get the benefit of doing that either in this situation. So, I think it's sort of one of those things that he'll have a great opportunity to be in a good situation here, sort of for the foreseeable future. I guess we assume that that'll extend into next year, through the end of 2025. But he's also got to like giddy up and get with the program. If he's to kind of, shift the tide of how people are looking at this opportunity for him in the moment.
I find it hard to believe that if McLaren hadn't come forward and said, we want to sign you, that he wouldn't have waited until 2025 and just cracked on with his Indy Next program regardless and waited for that McLaren opportunity. Because regardless of where McLaren's at in IndyCar versus the rest of the top teams and the results that it's achieved, it is one of the biggest brands in motorsport. And as a 19-year-old dude who hasn't raced an IndyCar yet, if McLaren's telling you that you're the next big thing and that they want to sign you, then you're going to wait and do your Indy Next program and then jump on it in 2025, in my opinion. I think doing it behind the scenes and getting him a little bit more acclimatized with the team. I know you can't really test in these times. It's not really common, and especially with the hybrid coming in, it's just making things a little bit more difficult. I'm sure we won't see any kind of open tests or anything until after the season's finished now. When we used to see teams popping up in different places. Maybe sometimes they were testing different drivers. We've seen McLaren do it with the likes of Nico Hülkenberg and Kevin Magnussen as well in the past. And we're not seeing those tests happen as frequently anymore because of the situation that the series is in, which is a bit of a shame. But yeah, I agree with everything you said, and I've made a lot of similar points or in some cases different points as well. You can head to the-race.com and read some of those if you're interested. But that's one thing that just occurred to me while you were speaking that I haven't really jotted down or anything yet or kind of put out there. But the logic of we had to sign him and put him in the car now because another team would have signed him and given him a 2025 seat is, I don't know if that stands up for me in those circumstances. And the other one we've not talked about is the fact that McLaren didn't feel the need to try and extricate Callum Ilott from WEC to come and drive that car for the rest of the year. They clearly felt Theo was strong enough, and obviously he didn't do enough to convince them that he was the guy for the future, or that he was the one who was good enough to race that car for the future. But like you said, I'm sure that was a big surprise that he ended up not coming away with a seat. JR, thanks for coming back and joining me. I'm sorry that we've not been able to get the last race in together, but obviously due to conflicts and scheduling and stuff with both of us, mostly me, we've not been able to get that done. So thanks for coming back and joining us. And yeah, we'll definitely be back next week with another episode because we need to address the season kind of reaching the halfway point. If you want us to do a mid-season rankings, let us know, because that's traditionally what we do and tend to piss off half the IndyCar grid while we're doing it, but we do it anyway because you guys love it. So let us know if you want us to do that.
We tend to at least really piss off one person.
Yeah, a driver. At least one driver every year, which is great.
At least one driver is really pissed off, which I think means we're doing a good job.
It means they're listening, JR. That's what it means. It means we're the IndyCar podcast to come and listen to, because all the drivers are listening to it too. But we also need to address the introduction of the hybrid, which is just I still feel like people just say this with real kind of in a real blasé way, but this is the first time this engine formula effectively is changing since 2012, and it's happening in the middle of a season, in the middle of a championship race. And I know that's been happening. We've known this has been happening for a while, and we knew it was coming. But to be a week away from it just fills me with anticipation, trepidation, all sorts of feelings about what's going to happen next week. Whether everything's just going to stay exactly the same and it won't make any difference whatsoever, or if the whole thing is just going to go in a sideways direction. I don't know. But the last test at Milwaukee was particularly positive. I don't think they had any failures or anything like that. Got a lot of run in. So a little bit of positivity there to finish the podcast on. But we'll be back next week with another episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast.
The Athletic.